hot points, poorest regions and epidemics epicenters. International organizations carry out their activities in parts of the world where they are critical for people. They unite countries and continents, save millions of lives and solve global problems. Watch more of this in Kazakhstan International Vectors. Work or health? Annually, more than 300 million people suffer employment injuries. Unfortunately, according to the statistics of the International Labour Organization, one person dies on the job each 15 seconds. The army of unemployed continues growing. There are more than 200 million of them. The real number of unemployed people is much higher than it is shown in the statistics. Some scientists associate a person's work with a mirror of his or her inner world. Doing something you don't like and being successful in life is impossible. Many people have families, parents and children, so sometimes they have to fulfill jobs they don't like. Experts recommend people to think over their future profession from school days. For this purpose, many educational institutions invite trainers who advise pupils on how to make a right choice. Special tests help teenagers to decide on their vocation. Alihan Tulinbayev conducts these tests. Earlier, he was also among those who chose a wrong specialty. Firstly, I qualified as a lawyer. However, now I don't work in this sphere. I like working with children. I like psychology. I help children because I don't want them to have the same problems which I had some time ago. How to find the job of one's dream and what epidemics threatens the youth. Coming up next. A wrongly chosen qualification is one of the reasons of youth unemployment. Experts calculated that last year the number of young people aged between 15 and 24 years without a job reached almost 74 million. In the UN, this tendency has already been identified as the epidemics of present days and one of the main problems of present time. In the meantime, the International Labour Organization has set the eradication of youth unemployment as one of its priority tasks. The International Labour Organization brings unemployment issues to discussion every year at its conferences. Such problems are being solved by means of a dialogue between representatives of different continents who make coordinated decisions. The International Labour Organization is a special UN agency which deals with the issues of improving labor conditions and lives of working people. It was established in 1919. The organization has its headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland, and currently consists of 185 member countries. In order to maintain a well-balanced labor market, the ILO develops norms and regulations which are then followed by almost all the countries. About 400 such documents were worked out through the existence of the organization. Convention is a standard act of an advisory nature. Once adopted by the Parliament and signed by the President of the ILO member country, it acquires status of a regulatory act. Each member state independently decides on the necessary number of adopted conventions. After their ratification, a country is obliged to follow certain regulations at the national level and provide true and timely information about the efficiency of the actions taken to the International Labour Organization. By adopting regulations and conventions, we conclude agreements, in particular general agreements. We can also bring up an issue on ratification of an ILO convention ourselves. A state assumes obligations by introducing them into its labor code in the form of certain articles. Employees in some countries work 50 and sometimes even 60 hours per week, instead of prescribed 40. It is a violation of the ILO Convention, which states that a normal work schedule should not exceed 8 hours per day. At the same time, some states have already reduced working hours. However, such measures by no means affected the labor productivity. On the contrary, the performance improvement could be observed almost everywhere. The Netherlands is the country with the shortest work week, a little over 30 hours. The work week in France lasts 35 hours, in Denmark 37 hours, and in Germany 1 hour more. Trade unions in many countries state for the reduction of working hours. Currently, their activity is becoming of greater importance. Thus, earlier trade unions only advocated for the improving of labor conditions. Nowadays, they have faced one more challenge of reducing the unemployment rate. And it should be noted that they have this status owing to the ILO Convention on Freedom of Association. In the US and the UK, they have become especially popular. Statistically, almost a quarter of the UK citizens, or 6 million people, are members of some trade union. More and more attention is paid to the protection of rights of trade unions. Stronger trade unions will be able to solve such a problem as unemployment. It will not be so easy to dismiss a person, and employers will be satisfied with their workplaces because their rights will be protected. Eradication of any types of forced labor and slavery is another goal of the organization. The relevance of this problem can be proved statistically. For the last several years, more than 20 million people became the victims of slave trade. Of them, more than 1 million were children. According to the ILO, the annual revenue of such business is estimated at $150 billion. The ILO's task is taking measures to prevent forced labor. Special attention should be paid to defending the rights of socially vulnerable workers, such as migrants. Women in some countries should not face such problems as hard labor conditions and unworthy labor remuneration. Children's labor is a matter of special attention in the ILO. Moreover, the economic and political situation in a number of countries has significantly deteriorated. According to experts of UNICEF, 2014 became the most tragic year for a great many of minors. Thus, 230 million children lived in armed conflict zones. A lot of them were abducted, sold in slavery, and exploited as soldiers. Alihan considers that a single test cannot give the answer to one of the most topical questions for school children: what I want to be in the future. For this purpose, a special action plan is needed, he adds. You can be interviewed or imitate your profession. Imitation is the most effective. It is a 2-week training where you play the role of an employee every day. Whose working rights are violated most of all, and how does labor migration change the modern labor market? Coming up next. The late 19th century is associated with a rapid industrial development. New production branches and the transfer from manual labor to industrial plants brought about a lot of changes, especially in the life of the working class. The number of working hours increased, salaries dropped, and the workers' compensation system did not function. The workers' rights were ignored. It resulted in numerous strikes, protests, and unrest. The labor market needed regulation. And only in the beginning of the 20th century, the question of the establishment of a specific authority was raised in the League of Nations. The International Labour Organization was established in 1919. Its key points is that all the issues within the International Labour Organization are solved with the participation of 3 parties: the state, the representatives of employees, and the employers. The 21st century is also called the century of globalization. The able-bodied population from different parts of the world has obtained the chance of moving freely from country to country and now actively uses this chance. Indeed, nowadays labor migration is growing very fast. Analysis of the World Bank forecasts that the number of such workers will exceed 250 million people as early as by the end of this year. We should also understand that people who go abroad do it out of bare necessities. And it is not a secret that labor migrants leave their countries due to economic, social and political reasons. Only in the last year, almost 900,000 labor migrants moved to the EU countries. 250,000 of them arrived there illegally. According to the forecasts of the International Organization for Migration, the number of illegal migrants can reach 1 million by the end of this year. This, in its turn, can provoke rising of unemployment rate. The International Labour Organization forecasts that by 2018 the total number of unemployed people will increase by 13 million and reach 215 million. To meet this challenge, the ILO suggests put under control migratory flows by means of various intergovernmental agreements or by adopting appropriate laws. We should monitor these migratory flows. Russia is a good example. It adopted the law which allows to enter the country only to those who passed language and legislation exams. Many violations are revealed among so-called house workers. In most cases, these are service employees. According to the ILO statistics, there are from 50 to 100 million of such workers, and the majority of them are labor migrants. Often employers conclude with them only oral agreements. In its turn, this entails late salary payments or non-payment, as well as the absence of any other benefits and various compensations. The regulatory measures on this issue are spelled out in the ILO Convention. The Convention foresees the measures which should be taken by states on national level and focused on legalization of house workers. In particular, each state should issue quotas on such house workers. Another problem addressed by the ILO is the discrimination against women. Recently, the organization drew attention of the international community to an air company which infringed upon the rights of its female employees by dismissing them in case of marriage. Following the intervention of the labor organization, the company's management eased its requirements. Violations like these can be observed in many countries throughout the world. Another issue the ILO deals with is women's status in labor relations. All we know how motherhood affects women's status and makes them vulnerable as employees. One more step towards choosing the future profession is meeting with representatives of various higher education institutions, Alihan thinks. Several times a year, school children are offered a possibility to communicate with specialists who help them to orientate themselves on the labor market. Indeed, many professions, which today are considered fashionable and prestigious, can become unclaimed in the nearest future. At the same time, there are specialties which have been remaining in demand for many years. For instance, in Kazakhstan there is a great demand for agricultural professions because highly qualified specialists are needed in agricultural areas. There is also demand for teachers. In fact, we lack young specialists in this sphere. Specialists in the oil and gas industry are also needed. Last year, 350,000 people became victims of industrial accidents and more than 2 million died as a result of professional diseases. The ILO reports that the main reason for that was safety violation. Currently, the organization recommends countries to adopt the Convention on Labor Safety and Hygiene. This convention obliges the member countries to adopt necessary legislative and organizing measures at the national level in order to ensure occupational safety. It means that safety inspectors and specially trained people with technical education in appropriate sphere should monitor the situation at enterprises. Improving the labor code is also a relevant issue for many states. The ILO suggests countries to create a legislative base which would answer the up-to-date economic and social requirements. Currently, a new labor code is also being developed by Kazakhstan. We are enhancing the social partnership system in order to improve the dialogue with the authorities. This tripartite system is very important for us. Miner, fireman and electrician. These professions are rated among the most dangerous in the world. However, there are dozens of other occupations which make people jeopardize their lives. One of them is woodcutter with 93 fatalities per 100,000 people. The principal danger comes from falling trees and gasoline-powered saws. Moreover, people have to work in places where medical assistance is often unavailable. Because of that, far from everybody can become a woodcutter.